Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're digging into a really quite a profound redefinition of leadership. It comes from Lóng Tíng's work, Leadership from the Breath, an Introduction. Now, Lóng Tíng, who's the founder and CEO of Lóng Tíng Enterprises and also the author of the Global Leadership Insights 2030 trilogy, he puts forward this pretty challenging idea. Leadership is not about control. It is about presence. And that statement, well, it really makes you rethink what it means to lead effectively today. So I'll be arguing that presence truly is the core, that it can in fact replace those traditional ideas of control.
And I'll be taking a slightly different angle. While I absolutely see the value, the deep importance of presence, I question whether we can completely dismiss control or, let's say, strategic direction. How does presence alone really navigate the sheer complexity of global business, especially when dealing with what Ting himself calls the fragile lines of our time? The source material gives us a lot to chew on here, highlighting this fascinating tension between, our inner state as leaders and the external actions we need to take.
Yeah, it really does shift things, doesn't it? Lóng Tíng's perspective moves leadership away from, what often feels like just managing levers and controls, doesn't it? More towards something organic, an expression of presence. He's very clear that his work, like the Global Leadership Insights 2030 trilogy, isn't supposed to be, just another management book. No, the goal is to create a living space for vision, for practice, for inner transformation. And that intention, I think, is absolutely key. It emphasizes that leadership starts with something fundamentally human, the breath we share, the silence before words, the courage to listen across cultures. It's not about just telling people what to do, it's about finding a deeper resonance. And even how he sets up the series, calling himself a companion instead of a lecturer, that points to this less hierarchical, more relational way of being, which is vital, right? For building those bridges between West and East, between tradition and modernity, and for nurturing different perspectives carried by the same breath. So from this view, real influence, real guidance in a global world, it flows from that authentic presence, that deep human connection, which makes the old top-down control seem not just less effective, but maybe even, unnecessary for lasting impact.
Okay. I acknowledge the importance, the invaluable aspects of presence, I really do. But I suppose I approach it differently. Ting's statement that leadership is not about control, it just feels like maybe an incomplete picture, especially when you look at his own background. I mean, system engineering, CEO of a major enterprise, Lóng Tíng Enterprises. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do you actually lead a company, put a vision into practice, or navigate these really fragile lines of our time without any kind of strategic direction or clear decision-making or what most people would call control? He says leadership is more than strategy, more than power. And I agree, it is more than those things. But more than doesn't necessarily mean completely without, does it? Inner transformation, listening across cultures, absolutely crucial. But the day-to-day realities of operating across cultures, across borders, that often demands clear choices, allocating resources effectively, holding people accountable for results. And those are fundamentally forms of control. So for me, the challenge isn't throwing out control altogether. It's about how to use it responsibly, ethically, alongside presence, right? To make sure that the vision and the practice actually leads somewhere tangible in these complex, messy, real-world systems.
Okay, so let's really unpack that phrase, not control. When Ting says that, I don't think he's arguing for, complete chaos or letting everything fall apart. It seems he's pushing back against a specific kind of control, the top-down, coercive, command and control style. I'd argue it's a fundamental shift he's proposing, suggesting that presence actually replaces that kind of control as the main way to influence people and create a different, maybe more organic kind of order. He points to the breath we share as the starting point. That suggests leadership flows naturally from our shared humanity, from connection and mutual respect, not from someone exerting power from the top. And this allows for a vision and practice to grow more authentically, making the whole system potentially more resilient, more adaptive than one built purely on external rules. It leans towards, self-organization, emergent strategy.
I'm sorry, I struggle with the idea that it's a complete replacement for all forms of control or structure. If Lóng Tíng is running Lóng Tíng Enterprises, or he's deep in a system engineering project, there just has to be some way to ensure everyone's pulling in the same direction, right? Some mechanisms for coherence, for clear direction, for accountability. We could call them guiding structures or adaptive frameworks, maybe, but they still involve setting boundaries, making decisions about which way to go. Even something like fostering inner transformation within a team that usually needs some kind of structure, some way to encourage it and maybe see its effect. So, what does it look like in practice, a leadership totally without these structured elements? Especially when you're building bridges between cultures, between languages, between worlds. That inherently means managing really complex expectations, sometimes even conflicting goals. How does his role as a cultural ambassador succeed without any kind of strategic influence or decision-making power, which, let's be honest, involves shaping outcomes? It feels like some form of control, even if gentle.
Right, but maybe the distinction is the source of that structure. What Ting seems to advocate for through presence isn't the absence of structure, but a structure that emerges differently. Think about a complex system engineering project. Okay, the old way might be imposing rigid principles and sign-offs from the top. But a more agile team, one driven by presence, they often thrive on deep collective ownership, right? Shared understanding, emergent design. This naturally reduces the need for that traditional external top-down control because the control becomes, internalized and distributed within the team itself. That shared breadth allows for collective decision-making, for tapping into the group's intelligence, for intrinsic motivation. These things start to replace the need for someone outside imposing control. The order emerges from within the system, you see, not dictated from above.
I appreciate that distinction you're making between top-down and internalized or distributed control. And yes, absolutely, distributed intelligence is incredibly powerful. But even in the most agile setups, don't you still usually find some baseline principles? Maybe architectural guidelines, clear roles, decision points for critical stages. Without something like that, even the most present and well-intentioned team could drift off course, right? Into scope creep or technical debt, eventually leading to failure. My worry is whether Ting's not control idea goes so far as to dismiss even these essential, sometimes collaborative, forms of structured guidance. How do you guarantee project integrity or strategic alignment across a whole global company without someone somewhere having the responsibility to make the hard calls, to say no to certain directions, or to shift resources when circumstances change? That's still steering the ship, isn't it?
And without that steering, the vision, well, it might just stay a vision and not become a reality.
But I think the point is that the way outcomes are shaped changes fundamentally. Ting directly links inner transformation to leadership practice. He frames his trilogy as a living space for exactly that. This suggests that the outward actions of leadership, building those bridges, fostering exchange, they flow naturally, authentically, from an internally cultivated presence, from empathy, not from some pre-cooked strategy document or a set of directives someone wrote. That courage to listen across cultures he talks about, that's not a tactic, is it? It's an internal state, an authentic way of being. And that directly enables effective cross-cultural work. It shapes outcomes through understanding and collaboration, not force. So the action is there, definitely, but its origin story is different.
That's a really compelling way to put it, and I absolutely agree that inner transformation is foundational for a leader's integrity and effectiveness. But have you thought about the practical jump between that inner state, that inner transformation, and the really tough, often urgent external problems leaders face, leading across cultures, across borders, across the fragile lines of our time? Internal shifts are vital, yes, but external situations often demand concrete strategic planning. They demand careful resource allocation, and sometimes, yes, they demand exercising authority to get specific things done. Let's take your example, a cultural ambassador mediating a serious breakdown in talks between two groups. How would they handle that crisis just through their presence, without putting forward a clear action plan? or outlining specific steps for a resolution, or maybe making some decisive interventions to get things back on track.
Those interventions, even if they're done collaboratively, they still involve making choices, setting directions, which feels like aspects of control, however gently applied.
But I think maybe you're still framing intervention and action plans in that older way, as something imposed from outside, rather than something that emerges from the situation itself. Ting's idea of a living space for vision and practice, I think it implies that solutions to crises aren't necessarily predefined by the leader's brilliant strategy. Instead, they emerge from the collective presence, from that deep listening, from the shared understanding built within that space. When a leader truly embodies presence, they help create an environment where people feel safe enough to bring their whole selves, their creativity, their potential solutions to the table. And that allows for a more, organic path forward. Often a more robust one, too. The plan isn't dictated, it's kind of discovered together. So the external action, in this view, it's the result of that shared internal coherence, not something separate that gets bolted on.
Okay, I understand the ideal of emergent solutions, and it's undeniably powerful in many situations. But what about those really urgent, high-stakes moments? Maybe a major supply chain disruption hits Lóng Tíng Enterprises across multiple borders, or there's a sudden geopolitical crisis that impacts everything. In those cases, do you really have the luxury of waiting for solutions to emerge organically? Isn't there a point where a decisive leader, even one deeply rooted in presence, has to translate that internal alignment into clear, external, often very time-sensitive directives? How do you square the need for potentially rapid, coordinated action in an emergency with a leadership model that emphasizes this patient emergence from inner transformation? The source material itself points to Ting's work in system engineering and bridging fragile lines. Those fields often demand pretty immediate structured responses, don't they?
And yet look at Ting's own life, as described. It's always been about bridges, right? Between East and West, tradition, innovation, identity, belonging. And his method for building them is stated as being through presence, by opening a space for voices from around the world. Voices carried, as he puts it, by the same breath. This whole approach suggests that the best, most sustainable way to connect diverse people and solve complex cross-cultural problems isn't by imposing one framework or strategy over others. It's about fostering that mutual understanding, recognizing our shared humanity first, allowing solutions to bubble up from genuine connection and dialogue. Control, especially if it means imposing something, actually becomes a barrier in that context. It can shut down the very voices you need to hear to build a real bridge.
I see the appeal, definitely. Fostering understanding through presence is foundational, essential. But let me offer a slightly different lens on that bridge metaphor. The actual building of a bridge, whether it's a physical one in engineering or a metaphorical one between cultures, that usually takes very concrete planning, doesn't it? Careful resource management, a lot of coordination. And that inherently requires direction, and yes, some form of control to keep things on track. Operating across cultures, across borders, means you will encounter disagreements, maybe direct conflicts of interest. You have legal frameworks, regulations to navigate. How does presence alone make sure all these different viewpoints actually converge on a workable, actionable path forward, without some kind of guiding hand, or some agreed-upon parameters, or someone who can ultimately make a call if consensus just isn't happening?
Those all seem like aspects of control, or at least strategic leadership, that go beyond just being present and listening, especially if the aim is a functioning bridge, not just, a nice conversation.
I'd suggest, though, that the nature of that guiding hand is what fundamentally changes when you shift from control to presence. Instead of a hand that dictates terms, it becomes one that facilitates. It orchestrates the shared vision that has already emerged from that collective presence. The parameters, the boundaries, they get co-created because people have listened deeply to each other. Decisions, even the tough ones, feel more collectively owned because that foundation of trust and understanding is there. So it's not that there's no guidance, but it takes a different form. Influence is distributed, aligned through that shared humanity, not just concentrated in one person's authority.
But isn't even facilitation a way of directing the flow? It usually involves a framework, maybe an agenda, perhaps setting ground rules for interaction. These are all subtle, ideally collaborative, forms of control, designed to structure the interaction to reach some outcome. My point isn't that leadership needs to be authoritarian, far from it. But these structuring elements, these forms of guidance, they seem rarely entirely absent when you need tangible results, especially in the complex, diverse settings Ting describes. So the real question might be about defining what we actually mean by control and leadership. Does Ting's vision imagine a world where these structured elements just disappear? Or perhaps, are they just reimagined, made more human-centered, more collaborative?
And I think it's exactly at that point where the guiding hand shifts from top-down command to facilitation and nurturing a shared vision that Ting's argument really lands. The core idea is that true leadership ensures any guiding structures serve the collective breath, serve that human connection, rather than dominating it.
Right. It's clearly not a simple either-or situation. It's much more of a nuanced spectrum, isn't it?
Absolutely. So today we've really dug into Lóng Tíng's assertion, quite provocative really, that leadership is not about control. It is about presence. We've explored its depth, but also its practical side, what it means for leading globally. We looked at how his focus on inner transformation and the human element, that shared breath, could fundamentally shift leadership's core, especially for fostering understanding across cultures and building connections that lead to these kind of emergent, resilient ways forward.
And conversely, we've also considered the view that some level of strategic direction, decision-making, and accountability, things often labeled as control, likely remain pretty indispensable for navigating these incredibly complex global systems and actually achieving tangible results. We sort of probe that tension between what Ting rejects as control and what might be essential structured guidance or adaptive frameworks, especially for an organization like Lóng Tíng Enterprises operating across those fragile lines of our time.
Yeah, it's a discussion that really highlights the profound questions Lóng Tíng's work brings up, and how different ways of looking at leadership can shed light on both the challenges and maybe the opportunities of leading in this hyper-connected world we're in. It certainly pushes us to look beyond easy definitions and think harder about how influence really works.
Agreed. The material definitely provides rich ground for more reflection, particularly on that crucial balance between, our internal state as leaders and the external actions we need to take. There's certainly much more to explore in his work about how we square that vital need for human connection with the very practical demands of keeping organizations coherent and moving forward effectively.